Well, thank you, Joe, for the introduction, and thanks so much for having me. I'm really grateful to John and everybody at Hazelnut for organising such a wonderful and inspiring conference. I've heard so many things already this afternoon that are food for thought and food for the soul. So, on an overcast day in the summer of 2006, two men embarked on a voyage across Loch Long, a deep finger of seawater which runs north to south from the Clyde estuary in Scotland up into the Alps of Arrochar. Now, the vessel for their voyage was a 22-foot wooden boat powered by a small steam boiler specially fitted for the occasion by one of the crew, the artist Simon Starling. But the voyage was ill-fated. There was, quite deliberately, no fuel on board. So while Starling manned the tiller, his crewmate instead sawed chunks out of the boat's hull. Beginning well above the waterline, prizing off the beams and the planks to feed the boiler, but slowly, inevitably, working down to the final crucial strakes at the water level, whereupon the boat began to flood with salty water and was quickly overwhelmed, its furnace hissing and choking on the loch as it was swallowed beneath the waves. Now, it's an arresting image, a slapstick caper, which nevertheless seems to chime with something more profound about entropy, that is, the tendency of things to fall apart, and the relationship between this and self-sufficiency. It is the self-reliance of the boat which guarantees its doom. And there's something poignant and kind of magnetic about the inevitability of the whole thing. The puttering boiler earnestly steaming away, the tiller patiently manned, even while it's obvious to every eye that sinking is imminent. The work exists now as a series of photographs exhibited in Starling's retrospectives as glass slides projected onto the gallery wall. The slideshow ticks on with something of the inevitability of that original voyage, rhythmically moving towards the boat's sinking. And the artist notes that 15 years after he made this piece, it's become something of a favourite among audiences, greeted now like an old friend whenever it's exhibited, still resonating with our condition. Because our condition continues to resemble the doomed boat. We continue to hack away at creation, feeding it into the boiler of progress piece by piece. And we continue to steer earnestly toward the future, all the while sabotaging the resources that would make that future possible. All hands are on deck feeding the boiler, and the deck is splintering beneath us. Now, as we embark on a voyage together this afternoon, I will endeavour to navigate for us a course from despair towards something more hopeful. But true hope comes only after acknowledging reality. And Starling's work, I think, helps us to acknowledge and diagnose something of our situation. So I want first to set this work in a bit of context before using it to diagnose a destructive striving towards self-sufficiency at three different levels: personally, ecclesially, and societally. And having faced the doomed nature of our current style of propulsion, I'll propose that we look toward another boat sunk in different Scottish waters for an image of a more sustainable kind of seaworthiness. Before making this piece, Starling won the Turner Prize with works exploring similar themes of process, metamorphosis, and material consequences. He's perhaps best known for his piece Shed Boat Shed, which saw a large shed carefully disassembled and transformed by painstaking carpentry into a gondola-shaped traditional Rhineland punt about 30 feet long, paddled downstream to a gallery in Basel, where it was then reassembled as the very same shed from which it was made. And for the Turner Prize, he exhibited that reconstructed shed, as well as a bicycle converted to be powered by a hydrogen cell on which he crossed the Tabernas Desert, as well as a new piece, a series of 5 photographic platinum prints, titled together 1 ton, because they together required a whopping 1 ton of platinum ore for their printing, their photographic processing. These unassuming prints, titled like this, took on a kind of heavy weightiness. They spoke of the costliness in terms of energy and resources of all kinds of productions and processes, usually invisible. These pieces together illustrate Starling's concerns in the early 2000s. Everything is connected, he's saying, and nothing comes from nothing. Energy always comes from somewhere, from materials and processes and from sheer bodily craft. And objects and artifacts therefore have histories. They're made from specific things. Their transportation and transformation is laborious. It leaves marks. It has consequences. It is because of this concern for deep interconnectedness that Starling is such an insightful ecological artist. Everything is connected to everything else, and everything has real material consequences. From these concerns then emerges this piece, which is called Autoxylopyrocycloboros. It's a bit of a mouthful, that took some practicing. Now there's an interesting play going on in this work between cyclicality and entropy. Whereas Shed Boat Shed had a kind of cyclical shape from shed to boat to shed again, seemingly ad infinitum, the voyage across the loch was always intended to be a one-way trip. Starling cites among his influences for this the tragic career of the artist Bastian Alder, who was obsessed with falls and falling, and himself was eventually lost in the Atlantic while sailing toward his own exhibition. Alongside this, he's looking at the comic kind of pratfalls of Tom and Jerry and Mickey Mouse. I think you can see those reflected in the comedy of this piece. So gravity and entropy are looming large here. They can be evaded by desperate comic antics, but they can never finally be avoided. Things ultimately fall apart. Yet even in this work, Starling remains interested in the cyclical, the before and the after. The boat for this piece was originally steam powered, then it was converted to diesel propulsion, then it was abandoned entirely and sunk in a loch. It was then refloated by Starling and refitted for steam. So there's already a long history to the materials involved. And the title, Autoxylopyrocycloboros, riffs on the mythical Ouroboros, the tail-eating serpent of European tradition, symbolizing eternal rejuvenation. It's only the prefix auto, the self-eating, that renders this enterprise doomed, because the eternal cycle of sinking and rising is scuppered finally by the boat's self-consuming propulsion. So this sticks out in Starling's work as a special piece exploring something of a short circuit. His usual interest in continual metamorphosis is ending here in collapse. How then can Starling's art help us to think theologically about the climate and ecological crises? I'm bearing in mind here Natalie Wigg-Stevenson's recent book on performance art and theology called Transgressive Devotion. She's using performance art as an aid for theological meditation, and she cautions against using art as the mere representation of doctrine, instead asking that we let art tell us things about theology that we didn't already know. So I want to try and hold with that here. I also have in mind an image of how art, particularly physical art like Starling's, which is so sculptural and material, pieces like this can give us something to hold on to when thinking about more abstract theological notions. Like sacraments, that is material stuff, speaking of more than material realities, artworks can function like handholds on a rock face, giving us something to grip onto. So what aspects of the theology of our current crisis does Autoxylopyrocycloboros help us to get a grip on? The key principle, I think, is this. It's that the distinctive shape of this voyage speaks of the doomed nature of self-sufficiency. It is because of the illusory self-containedness of the boat's system that the boat ends up tearing itself apart. Indulging in the illusion of separateness from outside forces ironically ensures that those outside forces eventually breach and overwhelm the supposedly closed system. And this pattern, once diagnosed, can be noticed, I think, at different levels in our own lives, as I've already hinted, personally, ecclesially, and societally. Personally, in our own spiritual lives, the risk of indulging in illusory self-sufficiency is ever present, I think, as much for those identifying as Christian as for those who resist identification with any particular faith. We are all incredibly fond of trying to do without input from what is beyond us, whether we call that God or community or the nameless creative ground of things. And this strategy of independence can seem to work wonders in the short term. We can build up a great head of steam by this method. But the forces beyond us, which we prefer to ignore, the shadow side of our subconscious, the communities we push down on as we push ourselves up, even the God who is creating and loving us like an unstoppable rising tide. These forces, Starling's work seems to say, will eventually flood back in when our own very finite resources are spent. And that flood, in its suddenness, might feel more like floundering than flourishing. Ecclesially, too, I think the same pattern is present. A real risk in these days of declining attendance, of stretched finances, and the anxious imperative of growth. A church which defines itself over against the secular world risks limiting its resources to what it currently has on board, and it ultimately risks being overwhelmed by the communities which it intends to serve. We might notice this tendency towards self-sufficiency in, for example, the desire for all of a church's activities to be vocally and explicitly Christian, or perhaps in a reluctance to share space and energy and resources with allied, more secular agencies. The months I spent trying to arrange sanctuary spaces for protesters in the 2019 Extinction Rebellion protests in London gave me a keen sense of how many barriers can sometimes exist between church and not church. And some of these barriers are rooted in very necessary procedural and logistical concern, while others seem to stem from an idea that the church exists separately from the messy world of division and disagreement. Starling's work would seem to say that such separateness is itself destructive. It can only be maintained for a time before the waters come bursting in. Finally, and perhaps most obviously, the pattern is applicable to our life as a whole society. Even while environmental concerns begin to register more widely now in our national and international conversation, it seems we still engage in the collective illusion that with the right technological fixes, the right offsetting schemes, and the switch to electric cars and compostable straws, we can continue full steam ahead. In this exercise of creative accounting, the whole of creation is available as firewood. But if Starling's work on energy transfer and materiality has shown us anything, it's that nothing is without consequence. There is no free lunch in the material world, no simple green solution where heat and work are conjured from nowhere, going nowhere. Nothing, finally, can be outsourced. The recent Dasgupta report on the economic cost of the climate crisis was incisive work by a fine and prophetic economist, but I think it ought to give us something of a sinking feeling because its very premise that the climate crisis ought finally to be averted principally for economic gain is an exercise in continuing this self-sufficient thinking, aiming to keep the boiler running at all costs. So much of our thinking, such as continuing to travel long distances and simply offsetting carbon costs, is about how to carry on living as we do, rather than how we might live differently. We'll put anything in the boiler as long as it burns. I think we ought to hear the decking splintering beneath us. Now, I promised that I'd steer us toward hope, and hope comes in the image of a different boat and a different approach to seaworthiness. It's a rumour, really, but since we're all here because of rumours of hope from some fisherman long ago, perhaps a rumour will do. The writer Adam Nicholson tells in his book about the Shant Islands in the Hebrides of an old practice of sinking Hebridean luggers, rowing boats, in early spring so that their timbers can reabsorb water and so swell against each other, therefore becoming watertight, prepared for the fishing season ahead. Nicholson writes, "In half an hour, she was down to her gunwales. I watched, entranced, as she went under. It was a blessing, not a catastrophe. I could feel the wood absorbing the water, and it was like giving a thirsty animal a drink, a gulping at the longed-for element. The boat looked buried in the sea that morning. She no longer had an existence independent of the water, but sat there still and submerged as if in jelly, an embalming of her life, neither sinking nor floating, but absorbed by the water from which she was usually so distinct." This is an image that stayed with me since I first read it. It's a digression really in the course of the book, but it stuck with me. It speaks to the Christian understanding, I think, of the entanglement of life and death. It resembles a baptism, and therefore also a death and a burial, and beyond it a resurrection and a transformation of life. It seems to answer the same concerns as Starling's doomed voyage, but it ends in life rather than death. The crucial difference, I think, is that whereas Starling's boat bets on its separateness from the water and loses, these Hebridean luggers accept their continuity with the flood around them, and counterintuitively, they receive their distinctiveness as a result of that. Only by submersion do we finally avoid sinking, and only by a kind of dying do we finally receive life. Only by accepting the flood do we find our home within it. So what would that radical acceptance mean, personally, ecclesially, and societally? Individually, personally, I think it would mean cultivating faith as a kind of openness in relationship with God and in relationship with others. This insight was life-giving for me personally. Finding faith, I couldn't begin to pray until I heard prayer described not so much as sending something up, but as letting something in. Prayer becomes not a process of tearing off bits of yourself to feed the boiler, but rather a daring moment of letting yourself be submersed in God's reality. And when it's good, there's the feeling of the timbers swelling, finding a kind of seaworthiness which will help to navigate the world afresh. And just as we can draw life from acknowledging that we are submerged in God, so we can draw that same life from practicing the same openness with one another, openness to perspectives which jar with our own, which even might seem to sink our own. And ecclesially, I think this would mean imagining the church as much more porous and permeable with the world in which it lives and moves. This might mean more attention to noticing the currents of love and generosity outside the church, and more willingness to quietly join in with them. It might mean more attention to issues of communication, more listening to voices outside the church to try and understand how we are perceived by those for whom we claim to care. And it would certainly mean more willingness to notice and talk about the currents of fallibility and flawed humanity which flow through us as a church, since it is by acknowledging these that I think we avoid being overwhelmed by them. Finally, societally, I think this would mean eventually completely renouncing the idea of a kind of economic growth and prosperity separate from the flourishing of creation itself. It would therefore mean an end to the illusion of easy fixes and the creative accounting that is carbon offsetting, and a readiness instead to make much more radical changes to the shape of our lives. We need to reimagine what flourishing would look like, and it might look more like submersion than motoring along purposefully, but that submersion may prove to be the beginning of new life, characterized by attentiveness, generosity, and compassion. Of course, these three levels, the personal, the ecclesial, and the societal, feed into one another. We cannot begin the brave endeavour of letting the church be more porous in the world if we have not ourselves begun to make peace with deriving our life from being permeable to God. And we cannot begin the work of making society more at one with natural processes if we as a church are still indulging in the same illusions, such as paying lip service to net zero aspirations without necessarily committing to the utterly radical reshaping of life that those aspirations would require. But at each level, the task ahead of us has the same shape, I think. Will we try to insulate ourselves from the flood, or will we open ourselves to it? Will we shut out the waters of God's generosity, or let them in? It's worth noting that while Starling's comedy caper on Loch Long was a one-off voyage, setting course for failure, the Hebridean lugger and its sinking is a seasonal, practiced and traditional thing. In this exercise of learning to give ourselves to submersion, we too will need to draw on the collective wisdom of our traditions, much more than we will need the fabled new technologies of carbon capture. We can let ourselves be submerged in God and in one another only if we can trust in the tradition of such letting go. And so we will need our stories, our liturgies, our rhythms and our cycles now more than ever. If Starling's Autoxylopyrocycloboros shows us what's going wrong, perhaps the rumour of these Hebridean skiffs shows us a way forward. It seems, at least to me, that the shape of their cyclical dying and rising is a resurrection shape. And this is, in the end, I think, the only sustainable shape that truly living can ever take, as persons, as a church, and as a society. There will be no solution, no simple solutions to the problems of energy and resources. We will be submerged and changed as this crisis unfolds. But we can begin to shape our lives around that submersion, cultivating an openness to it, to each other, to the forces at work in the world, and to God. Thank you.
Rob, thank you very, very much for that. Wonderfully crafted there. Thank you for everything that you've just been sharing with us, and really inspiring stories and metaphors, and some really deep thinking from you and shared with all of us. We're almost up to our point in time. Just getting some comments in the chat, just reiterating just people's thanks and appreciation of you and what you've shared with us, Rob. That's just so brilliant, just looking at how art forms our understanding and inspires us towards learning and action, how to live differently, being open to God. And I really sort of drew in on that, being those things. You mentioned three things: that to a life towards attentiveness, generosity, and compassion. I'm sure that's been very inspiring for all of us, and people keep saying thank you and wonderful perspective. So we really appreciate that, Rob. Sadly, everyone, we're hitting our time. It's five to 6, and I know that you're all sort of probably a bit full in the brain and in the thinking. And I think that session for me particularly was just a real good refreshment after lots of input. And so thank you, Rob. And thank you everyone for being here. We've got our main session back in room 1 at 7 p.m. And we'll be hearing from Ellen Davis, an amazing Old Testament scholar. So thank you everyone for your input today and for listening well. Thank you to Rob. I'm going to stop recording and I'll close the room down, and you can all get some refreshment, food and drink, and just continue to contemplate the things that we've been receiving today. So thanks everyone. Bye-bye for now.